Good. Well, I think I want to thank Bob for giving a really great introduction to the collaboration. And rather than having to go over that, I'm going to be able to just focus on a disease that's close to my heart and has been part of Case Western's tradition for a long time, and that's talking about the TB research and its relationship to the Uganda CWRU research collaboration. And actually, some of the issues that were raised, cultural issues, issues of how do we empower our Ugandan colleagues to take the next step, is very germane to TB. I get to give a lot of talks about TB, and particularly to the medical students, and we usually try to enthrall them with the advanced technology that's around the corner, genetics, stem cells, and so forth. And I get to talk about a disease that's very old, that should have been solved a very long time ago, and hasn't, in fact, and there are a lot of reasons for this. And just to give you a little context, unlike HIV, which is clearly something that has come upon the scene very recently and is gone through the world at a very rapid pace, TB has been a problem that's been with us for a very long time and has persisted. And in part, the problems that plague TB control around the world, to some extent, are also going to be relevant to HIV, because they really are related to socioeconomic disparities and poverty. If you take the map of poverty around the world and you take the map of tuberculosis around the world, you can superimpose them. And if you're really, if you want to be very cynical, you could say, well, Henry, all you have to do to solve TB is to solve poverty, and you'll eventually solve the TB problem, and it will go away. Of course, it's not as simple as that. So just to give a little context for the history of TB, and most of you don't need to hear this, but increased TB in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, probably related to industrial revolution and urbanization, with increased crowding and poverty, allowing the infection to establish and continue to spread. Back in 1882, Robert Koch identified M. tuberculosis as the cause of TB. And at the time, his quote to his speech at the time is still very relevant more than 100 years later, which part of it is, you know, my disease is more important than yours, but apart from the pettiness associated with that, he also makes a very important point. So if I may quote him, if the importance of a disease for mankind is measured by the number of fatalities it causes, then TB must be considered more important than those most feared infectious diseases, such as plague, cholera, and the like. 1 in 7 of all human beings dies from TB, and if one only considers the productive middle-aged groups, tuberculosis carries away 1/3 and often more. And in fact, what is interesting about TB and HIV and malaria in the current era is that politicians and economists have recognized that solving these problems are critical for economic development. Because in fact, as Bob points out, women of childbearing age and young adults are affected by HIV, they're affected by TB, and these are the people that a country has invested in to educate, to drive the economic development into the future. And so these diseases are no longer just simply humanitarian issues. They really are tied to socioeconomic development and political issues, which is why they appear on the agenda of the G8 and the United Nations and in Security Council resolutions and so forth, rather than just simply as humanitarian activities for various NGOs. So much for my little soapbox. The TB skin test, we're still stuck with it, was developed in 1907 by von Pirket. BCG, a vaccine that's used widely around the world, was developed after long passage by Calmette and Guérin in 1921. And drugs for TB have been around since the late 1960s. In fact, we haven't had a good new drug since that time. So in a way, we have in TB what HIV would love to have: a partially effective vaccine, you know, a relatively cheap skin test for diagnosis, and cheap generic drugs that are available around the world. And in fact, in most countries, there's actually a national TB program whose responsibility is to monitor treatment, therapy, and so forth. And yet still, we have this huge problem. So it's not so so easy. And this is just kind of illustrated in this, oh, what happened to the United States? I guess it disappeared. Well, the point is that this is, we all like to show our world maps, and what this map shows is red is not good, and clear is obviously very good. It actually makes you disappear. But the point is that the disparities in the TB incidence rates around the world are huge, with areas of Africa and Asia and the former Soviet Union very heavily involved, other areas of the world such as the United States, Western Europe, and Australia, New Zealand having very little. And just for rough numbers, a third of the world's population is the number that gets bandied about 9 million cases a year. Half of those are smear positive. That means they're very infectious. HIV, although a significant part of that, is really a minor component of this problem worldwide. But what's really inexcusable is the number of deaths, because most of these cases are drug sensitive, simple TB. They should be treated, but it's simply an issue of getting the drugs to the right people and getting people to take them for the right length of time. So that's the format in which we're operating for TB research. And the TB research unit that Pam referred to earlier and Bob was actually established in 1994 by the NIH to really support translational research in tuberculosis. There's only one of these in the United States. And I'm a Johnny-come-lately to this one. I took this over in 1999 when Jerry Elner left the institution to go to the University of New Jersey in Newark, but really completely dependent on what went before for this to be established here. The TB research infrastructure was really established early on in 1996 after Fred. And then Tom Daniel and Jerry Elner went to Uganda and really started working on TB and TB-HIV research in Uganda. And it was because of this that the case was successful in developing and getting the tuberculosis research unit, which is now in its third cycle of competition. The whole principle of the TBRU is that we have multidisciplinary international research teams in Brazil, in Uganda, South Africa, the US, and the Philippines, with Uganda really being the center point for these studies, but other sites being involved as well. And the multidisciplinary component really consists of combining the two very strong human trial aspects, this is drug clinical trials and epidemiology, and then tying them with excellent microbiology and immunology, and also an important part is the repository. And it's the interdisciplinary interactions between these four disciplines that allow us to move ahead in addressing questions that really come down to fundamental questions of understanding how the human response to tuberculosis is orchestrated. That means immunology, that means response to drug therapy, that means the understanding of the microbiology. So this is really a multidisciplinary approach to trying to understand how humans respond to TB or not. So we have our sites. We have sites in Kampala, our major sites. We've had a site in Manila. We have a site in Cape Town, a site in Victoria. We had sites in San Francisco and New York, but just as the United States has disappeared, so have these sites. At one point, we're also working in Karachi, not the easiest place to work these days. So where do we work in Uganda? Oh, these pictures really look horrible. Bob's map of Uganda was a lot better, but we're in Kampala, where in fact most of our activities are in the Kawempe district of Kampala. Kampala is divided into a city center and then has a surrounding set of districts, and Kawempe is our primary location for most of it. And this is just simply a map superimposing by GPS the TB cases on top of a density map of the population. So what this Kawempe district has is areas of intense slum and very dense population, and more rural extensive areas as you go out further into the countryside from the center city. And where do we work? Well, we work at the Tuberculosis Treatment Center. This is the ward 5 and 6 where all the TB patients are admitted at, and also where the TB clinic is held. And right across the street from that, is our project site. So we're right there where the TB patients are. There are 2 wards, a female and a male ward, and most of the patients that are here are really because they're too far from home, they're too ill to take their pills. But TB in the developing world and in the U.S. as well is predominantly an outpatient disease. It's predominantly a disease of people taking pills as outpatient, and rarely anymore that they need to be admitted. Many of these will be HIV co-infected. These are our colleagues, Roy McGarrah, Bob mentioned earlier. Alphonse Aquera is the National TB Program representative, and Edward Mbide is really a leader in cancer research in Uganda, has also been a major voice for ethical issues about research in the developing world and access to resources, including HIV drugs. He's now head of the Uganda Viral Research Institute, and is really a remarkable person to meet and discuss it. We also have an outpatient clinic called the Komamboga Clinic in the Kawempe district, where we can do more family-based activities for some of our epidemiologic studies. So, what are some of the priorities for TB research in general, and where do we fit in? Well, probably the most important area of research is, and the Gates Foundation through its Global Alliance for Drug Development is interested in, how do we shorten drug treatment for TB? How can we make it even shorter than the current 6-month, quote-unquote, short treatment? Can we give the pills even more infrequently? Can we give them on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, rather than daily? Issues around HIV, TB, on when to start antiretroviral therapy, the whole issue of the drug interactions between HIV drugs and the drugs for tuberculosis, and then the interesting immunological questions around immune reconstitution. Obviously, multi-drug resistance, TB, is a problem in certain parts of the world. Luckily, in Uganda, that's not an issue, and so we don't have to be concerned about that for the moment. The issues of a more effective TB vaccine and a better way to deal with the latent TB infection are, of course, huge issues. And as all of you are aware, the paradox about TB infection or M. tuberculosis infection is that the reason we have so much tuberculosis is not because it's such a virulent organism, it's just that so many people are latently infected. And so if you have 10% of a third of the world's population, that's a lot of people. But there is this paradox where 90% or so will successfully control the primary infection, and the question is, who are they that go on to develop disease, and what can we do to better get rid of those last few bugs that can reactivate years later? So TB prevention and treatment trials of new drugs and regimens and adjuvant immunotherapy, surrogate markers, interaction HIV, TB, transmission. These are some of the more kind of basic research questions that can be addressed in areas where TB is endemic. Luckily, whereas the NIH was the primary source of funding for TB research for a very long time, a lot of Johnny-come-latelys have joined the field recently, and luckily so, particularly the Gates Foundation. The World Health Organization, of course, has always supported TB research, and then the Centers for Disease Control. And our projects in Uganda are all benefiting from these multiple sources of funding around specific topics and projects. So this is just one. So we have the tuberculosis research unit, and you should think of that as sort of a core basic program that supports these other activities. And one of the collaborations that we have in the TBRU is with the Center for Disease Control's TB Trials Consortium. This is their map. At least the United States is still visible here. Not a very pretty color, but nevertheless still there. There are 27 clinical sites for their Trials Consortium. I should note, and John Johnson is in Uganda, at the CDC right now, is that our site in Kampala has consistently enrolled more patients in their trials by 10 to 100-fold than all the other sites, even many more sites than some of the international sites that the CDC started to reach out to a number of years ago as the incidence of TB in North America started to decline, and the ability to enroll patients in new drug treatments just became increasingly problematic. So we're part of the TBTC Trials Consortium, and John Johnson is the principal investigator for that activity, which has been highly successful. So where do our TB patients come from, and how do we go about finding them? This is a picture of the TB ward that I showed you, that I mentioned to you earlier, and this is the hallway where twice a week patients and their families come to be seen and evaluated for starting on TB treatment. This cartoon just simply illustrates the incidence of HIV in this population. Our experience has been, unfortunately, consistently around 50% of our TB cases are co-infected with HIV, and that number hasn't really changed very much. This is our high-tech chest X-ray radiology department, the computerized system to bring the films to the fore, and it's really a beautiful sight, because I think it very nicely illustrates the extent of the problem. And yet there's a gentleman in here who will find you a film better than any computer system that you could possibly imagine, and he's a real character, as you might imagine, as well. So the X-rays that we get are very good quality, and a lot of them are coming from this room for use in our trials. There are medical wards, we have satellite health clinics, and as I mentioned, about 50% of them are HIV positive, and the vast majority are young adults. So we have a great research clinic. It's cramped, it's small, and we're actually in the process of trying to raise funds to build a real legitimate clinical research center at Malago Hospital, where we can really spread out our activities and expand. So far we've benefited from the generosity of Malago Hospital to lend us and let us use their space, which we've renovated and so forth and contributed to, but nevertheless, as their hospital becomes more in demand and their need for space increases, just like any other academic center, the squeeze is on for space, and our efforts to get our own research, clinical research center there are very active at this point. So we have an area with exam rooms. This is our medical officer, a patient, very bare bones, but it works. The key for a TB project is lots of open windows, so we don't have the risk of spreading the infection to others in the unit. And a huge cadre of excellently trained nurses, counselors. There's a whole process that's involved in doing clinical research, and involves many people, all of whom are Ugandan. And then we have an X-ray unit, and we're consistently, the technicians who work there, who were there before we even started, produce the best chest X-rays for the hospital, and so not only do they do our studies, but also patients from the main hospital come up to the TB ward to have their chest X-rays taken. Bob mentioned our laboratories. So at the Joint Clinical Research Center, we have basically 3 superb laboratories for our research projects. We have a TB laboratory with a BL3 facility area that is a negative pressure area. Negative pressure just means we have a bunch of fans sucking air through there, but still an area that's going to protect the workers who are working with the TB bacilli. Some high-tech machines to measure bacterial growth, as well as drug resistance testing, as well as facilities to do more advanced technology. People interested in new diagnostic tests and so forth are all being done in our mycobacteriology laboratory. The U.S. investigator most actively involved with this is Kathy Eisenach, who is at the University of Arkansas and has been involved from the very beginning in the TBRU's laboratory activities in TB, and was instrumental in setting it up. We also have a superb immunology laboratory. This laboratory looks better than my laboratory does upstairs. One of the first flow cytometers. This is now a little bit antiquated, but one of the first flow cytometers in sub-Saharan Africa, besides the one in South Africa, was placed in this laboratory in the early 1990s when Jerry Elner was involved and was critical for diagnosing the stage of HIV disease as well as for research purposes. Pierre Peters is a case employee. He's a technician who's been involved with international research from going back to Adel Mahmoud's days and is now actually very close to his home. He came from the Congo originally and is now in Uganda towards the end of his career working in the immunology lab. And Harriet Mayanja is the current chair of medicine and has been at Case, has gotten a master's in immunology from our pathology department through the Fogarty training, and is a leader in the immunology of TB on site. So we have superb laboratories. I mentioned two. The third lab is the lab that Bob mentioned earlier, which is a lab that works on HIV that is headed by Eric Arts, which has state-of-the-art sequencing facilities and whatever you need. So, and that's, I think, is very important to illustrate for any kind of international research like this. You need the patient population, you need dedicated investigators locally who are keen on moving ahead, and you need laboratories. Without laboratories, you can't go anywhere because you need to be able to detect the microorganism. You need to be able to do studies that look at the immune response or any other measurements that you need to do good quality clinical trials or observational studies. So just run through some of the clinical trials that we've done over the last 15 years. This is all preceding my time, but there have been a number of TB clinical trials. One of the problems in TB research is they love to abbreviate their drugs, and so you end up with these horrible titles of drugs. But trust me, these are all TB drugs of some sort. So the earliest studies were done in the early 1980s and early 1990s, there was a horrible drug called thiacidazone, which was used widely in Africa, which was highly toxic. It's a sulfa derivative, and it was used for HIV TB. It's cheap, and therefore it was used. And a study done by the collaboration, funded by CDC, clearly established not only that it was highly toxic, but that also it was highly ineffective. And they did a simple trial comparing, this is rifampin, H stands for INH, and Z stands for pyrazinamide, the key three drugs for any drug, a TB drug regimen. And this was streptomycin with thiacidazone, and this drug was clearly inferior. There have been studies on preventive therapy in TB in HIV-positive adults with the CDC. The WHO has done studies looking at comparing ethambutol versus rifampin in the extension phase for HIV-TB. We've also done a lot of immunotherapy. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a lot of enthusiasm for immunotherapy for TB as well as other infectious diseases. And those included things with recombinant IL-2 or MVACA, which is it's a mycobacterium that's derivative it's a mycobacterial species that is a cheap vaccine. Our studies were done extremely well through the TBRU and clearly demonstrated that these two immunotherapies had no role in TB treatment. Unfortunately, they were negative, but they were well done, and they put to rest an area of research that has been now largely abandoned. There have been studies looking at HIV-TB, and this is before we had antiretroviral therapy. And this is, may seem paradoxical, but prednisolone is used as a way of suppressing the immune response, because part of the model for why HIV-TB interact with one another is that one immune activation stimulates the other, and as you are trying to fight TB, you get more viral replication for HIV and so forth, and that using an immunosuppressant might be one way to break that cycle. That study also showed that there was a transient effect, but there was no long-term effect to benefit the HIV-TB infected person with that drug. Done a lot of studies looking at immunological and surrogate markers. I'm an immunologist, so I'm very interested in trying to figure out what it is about the human immune response that works or doesn't work in TB. Some of those things are more basic in nature, and some of those things are very practical in nature. For example, we've started looking at cytokines in sputum. Gamma interferon can be measured in the sputum of patients, of TB patients. Is that something that could be used as a diagnostic test for chronic inflammatory processes in the lung where TB would be a major contention? And so these are areas that we have pursued. So I'm just going to quickly go through a few of these studies in a little bit detail to give you just some flavor for them. So this was only randomized clinical trial ever done, comparing safety and efficacy of the thiacetazone regimens, confirmed concerns about cutaneous toxicity of thiacetazone in HIV-infected persons. And they really guided TB control policy and led to further studies of ethambutol and rifampin-based regimens in HIV-TB. So, and that's the point that Bob was mentioning earlier. It's important when you do these studies that these are studies that can have some local public health impact. There are obviously studies that are extremely interesting to do from a basic point of view, but the ethics of doing those sorts of studies in a disenfranchised population is a very tricky one. And so it's very important to think about your studies in terms of what would be the public health impact, and particularly these are discussions that you have with your colleagues in Uganda well before you embark upon a study like this to make sure that they're on board with what's being proposed. The Preventive Therapy study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, caused quite a bit of controversy because it was comparing 3 regimens of treatment for latent TB-infected, in 2,800 HIV-infected adults. This was a study that was sponsored by the Centers for Disease Control. Clearly, treatment decreased the incidence of TB by 65%. However, it didn't last for forever, because in this hyperendemic environment, people would get reinfected. This is clearly a very good study, was well done. The issue of using preventive therapy in TB endemic countries is still very controversial. Many countries still think that their primary focus should be on identifying those people with active disease, and then maybe sometime later they will look at TB control with preventive therapy. There are studies that are funded by the Gates Foundation that's trying to look at this on a population level in TB endemic countries to try to see if you went and did broad preventive therapy in a population-based approach, could you have an impact on the TB epidemic? So this is still very much of a work in progress in terms of where preventive therapy will fit in. There's an ethambutol study that just was published, which clearly established that in the continuation phase, and so in TB treatment, the way you think of it, you have 2 months of very intensive therapy with 4 drugs, and then you have 4 months of therapy with just 2 drugs. And in many countries, they use ethambutol and INH during that continuation phase. And the reason they choose it is because it's cheaper and well tolerated. But this study clearly proved that the failure rate was much higher in that group, and that you needed rifampin-based regimens, a continuation phase as well, to prevent reactivation or relapse of tuberculosis. So Chris Whalen was very interested in addressing the question. Everybody knows that as your immune system fails, TB will become reactivated. But the flip of the question was, once you have active tuberculosis and you also have HIV, what happens to the HIV? And this is still a somewhat controversial area, but I think most people agree that if you have a higher CD4 count, that is, you have an immune system that's relatively preserved, that when you develop active tuberculosis, you then accelerate the course of HIV, and you more rapidly have the HIV progress to AIDS, that is, to a CD4 count that's less than 200. And Chris did a number of epidemiologic studies. He did them here in the US. He also did them in Uganda to really look at whether or not the higher CD4 count individuals had a shortened, a more accelerated course of HIV? And the answer was basically yes in that regard. And so based on these kinds of studies, there's been an interest to try to interrupt this cycle by using a variety of interventions. And I'm just going to skip ahead. And that's our current study focused on called PART, Punctuated Antiretroviral Therapy in HIV/TB. If you think of the interaction of HIV and TB in the following kind of linear manner. So you have CD4 loss due to progressive HIV infection. MTB that's latently present inside a macrophage in your lungs, and a granuloma that's quiescent starts to replicate, starts to reactivate, and realizes, well, it doesn't realize it, it's not that sophisticated, but basically has no immune system to resist it. As it activates, the TB starts to induce secretion of all kinds of cytokines by the cells that it's in, as well as in the immediate microenvironment. In that microenvironment, then, macrophages that have latent in HIV start to have increased replication of HIV, and then as that progresses, the CD4 depletion accelerates and the course of the disease progresses. So what can you do to intervene? There's sort of three areas you can intervene. Well, obviously, you need to treat the tuberculosis. That's a no-brainer, and everybody gets started on TB therapy. Early on, before we had antiretroviral therapy, the idea was, what if we blocked this cytokine activation using a variety of immune modulators? One of the cytokines that always plays a role in the activation of HIV is TNF. So people tried things with TNF inhibitors. Prednisolone was the most sledgehammer of those approaches to try to block the cytokine response. The bottom line was, at least the way we did it, this had a transient effect but not a permanent effect. So our current approach is, well, what if we start treating the HIV earlier during the treatment for active tuberculosis, and can we do something to decelerate this progression? And we've called this trial PART, Punctuated Antiretroviral Therapy in HIV/TB. And what we do is we take individuals with high CD4 counts, people with CD4 counts of greater than 350, who develop active tuberculosis, and give them 6 months of antiretroviral therapy, and then and also treat their tuberculosis, of course. And during that time, we measure what happens to the virus, but then we stop the therapy and see what happens. Do they go to the AIDS stage more quickly, or hopefully more slowly, than people who don't get antiretroviral therapy? Now you may wonder, isn't this unethical? Well, it's not unethical, because the standard for starting antiretroviral therapy is around 200 CD4 counts. So we're well above that, and we're well at a stage when most people would not start HIV therapy, and certainly not in a resource-limited setting. So this is a trial that's funded independently by NIH through the Division of AIDS. It again takes advantage of the infrastructure that we have in Uganda. Just want to mention that the other trials that we have going on, that there's a TBTC study. This is the Center for Disease Control's network that I mentioned earlier, Study 28. Here you go. Here's the letter salad again. They're actually trying to see if moxifloxacin, which is a quinolone, as a new antibiotic it's not a new antibiotic for those of us who are in infectious diseases, but it's a new antibiotic for TB. And they're trying to figure out, is there a place where we can substitute moxifloxacin for the current regimens? And this is a little bit of a risky trial. It's based on some animal studies in mice where the INH component of the standard regimen is being replaced with moxifloxacin. And we'll see. This study is ongoing. It's called the Study 28, and so forth. We also have a phase 3 study funded by NIH, the TBRU, which looks at shortening treatment for TB from 6 months to 4 months in people with more minimal disease. So just to kind of come back to some more observational studies that we're interested in, and that is a bunch of what we have called as cohort studies. And this is our community-based study in Kawempe in Kampala, which is an epidemiologic study which is trying to evaluate environmental as well as host factors that are associated with progression from TB infection to active TB. And this study allows us to apply advanced immunological methods, genetics, human genetics of TB, as well as other approaches, including interactions of HIV and TB, to try to understand why it is that people who get infected, who are following the green line, that is, develop persistent infection, that is 90% of us, why do some of us go on and follow this purple line where at some point we develop reactivation disease? There's another group of people who never even control primary infection. Most of these are individuals with advanced HIV disease or small children. But this group is really the critical question that needs to be addressed. And we have, that's the focus of the Tuberculosis Research Unit. It's also the focus of our Gates Foundation-funded projects. So these are not trials. These are really trying to understand the human immune response and why does it succeed and why does it fail? How come TB, which is such a great generator of an immune response, succeeds in resisting our immune response? What is it about the organism? How does it do it? And what can we do to improve this? So I'm just going to wrap up, and I'm going to echo some things that Bob has mentioned. So what are some of the lessons and difficulties that certainly I've learned from working overseas? Well, the first thing is human clinical trials take a very long time from idea to enrolling the first TB patient. And we've been a little bit luckier in TB. I know Bob has struggled tremendously with the ACTG studies in that regard, and it just seems to take forever. Some of it is fine. Some of it is about safety. A lot of it has become, unfortunately, very bureaucratic. The other thing is that each foreign site, no matter where you work, has unique issues and problems. Some of those issues and problems are not good, but they're different for each individual place. The other is that everybody's got lots of TB patients, but as soon as you show up to do a study, they all seem to disappear. They never seem to materialize. So don't be fooled as you go out and try to recruit a new site. Most importantly is that foreign site development requires a very long-term commitment. And one of the things about our collaboration in Uganda is that it's not dependent on a single person. Bob and I are here as representative for up to 7 or 8 different principal investigators here on this end and on the Ugandan end as well. And that allows people to turn over. If I go away, someone else will come in my place, and similar for Bob. And that creates tremendous stability. This is really about institutional commitments as well as some individual commitments, of course. The other is international research is all about development. And what I mean by development is really economic development, not just simply research development. There's training, there's tech transfer, we provide a lot of jobs, and we provide a lot of health care. As part of our research projects. And so research is not just a simple narcissistic activity to promote our own careers and for Bob and I to give talks here in front of everybody and try to impress you with how smart we are. This is really about an exchange and about development. And I think that's really, really important. It's difficult because a lot of people say, well, why aren't you out there feeding the starving babies, and why aren't you out there providing care? Because those impulses, when you go to Uganda, you'll be seduced very easily, and you could spend all your time doing that. That's not what the Ugandans want. They know they need that also, but they're very keen on this tech transfer, on this development, and they want to see the latest technology applied, but in the right way. It's a two-way partnership, and finally, it's really immensely rewarding, both on a human as well as a scientific level. And I think that's my song and dance. I think my final slide is similar to Bob's. It just lists all the Ugandan colleagues who couldn't be here today, without whose help we couldn't move forward. I would just like to mention one person. I don't know if he's on here. Do we have Moses Jaloba? Yes, I want to mention one particular person because one of the questions someone had earlier is, well, what's the way forward and how do we get to the next step? And one of the great difficulties that I think many of us working in Uganda realize is part of it has to do with the culture, part of it has to do with life there. And that is, how do we get the Ugandans to really be active principal investigators, writing their own grants, going out to seek the funding, and we just being consultants for them? And that's the next step. That's the next challenge. It's not easy. But there's one example I want to highlight. Moses Jaloba, a very talented physician from McCary Medical School. He came to CASE first to do a master's in the micro department, then went on to do a PhD in microbiology, has gone back to Uganda, and has benefited from a funding stream that the NIH has made available through the Fogarty Center and also through the IRID program. And these are NIH-funded grants, and Moses was able to basically get the equivalent of a small R01 as an investigator without a Mzungu. Mzungu are people like Bob and myself, and when we go to Uganda, we're not hard to recognize. So this was done by a Ugandan who learned in the US how to do research and how to write proposals, and on the first go-around got an R03. He's doing molecular biology of M. tuberculosis in the microlab. We helped him equip his lab through Fogarty funding and TBRU funding, and he's training young, eager graduate students in Uganda to learn how to clone TB genes and knock out genes in TB and so forth and so on. He's also responsible for helping run our clinical laboratory. So people like that is what we need, and that's the next phase, and that's the next challenge for our collaboration. And I think on that soapbox note, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
If I recall correctly, the United States experience with tuberculosis was that tuberculosis became very, the incidence declined way before the occurrence of the anti-tuberculosis medication.
Correct.
And that it was dramatic and such that by the time the 1950s arrived, when the drugs arrived, closure of the TB sanitariums was occurring. What is the experience, what can we learn from that experience and what happened in the United States to allow the incidence of and then the prevalence of tuberculosis to wane when we didn't have any drugs?
So there are two answers to that question. First is economic development. And what I mean by economic development is sanitation, less crowded living conditions, better nutrition. So that's number one. Number two is good public health infrastructure. You're absolutely right. If you look at the trend, in fact, I have a slide of this. If you look at the trend of TB, in fact, in late 19th century Europe, there were differences. The Germans and the British started working on public health measures to deal with TB even before or about the time that Robert Koch discovered the bacillus. The French, too busy drinking wine and having a good time. So the rates of TB in Paris remained relatively stable. But in London and Berlin, they started to go down. And part of it was a sanatorium movement. The sanatorium movement did one thing, which is remove highly infectious individuals from the society so that the transmission was broken down. But they also realized that there were issues around crowding. The famous story is Florence Nightingale, during the Crimean War, figured out that if she moved the cots of the individual soldiers just a few more feet from one another, the incidence of TB went down. When Ronald Reagan was president, and don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, we took all our crowded homeless people in New York and crowded them in a huge, small, tight space. Now, Florence Nightingale was around. She said, just move those cots a little bit further and you'll stop the transmission. So there's a lot of things that were done that preceded the drug treatment. And so that's why I'm saying if we deal with economic issues and we deal with development, those things need to go together. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing research, we shouldn't be figuring out how to do a better job, but problems like TB, problems like malaria, problems like HIV are very tied to societal issues and political and economic considerations. So that's a long answer to your question.
There's another observation. In the United States, the introduction of compressed natural gas to fuel homes instead of coal resulted in a dramatic reduction in a relatively short period of time, paralleling the decrease in tuberculosis in outdoor and particularly indoor air pollution. And my question to you, since you're an immunologist, what is the impact of biofuels, coal being and its pollution on the immune system? And were we to clean up the air in the home of Uganda, maybe we would decrease tuberculosis.
Well, I think so to answer your question, London in the 19th century was not a very pleasant place to live. The fog in London was a highly particular, cold-driven thing, and a lot of people had chronic bronchitis, chronic bronchiectasis. In Uganda, people used charcoal fires, and so there's lots of smoke and particulates in that environment. So I think people have always made an assumption there's a connection, chronic irritation and inflammation. Unfortunately, at least in my mind, our immune assays aren't good enough to really be able to say what's the specific effect, except for the fact that we know that if you suppress the immune system, TB will become reactivated. So we have to assume that some of these sort of chronic environmental factors have some very maybe non-specific effect on maintaining infection. And maintaining granulomas. Really what we're talking about is maintaining the integrity of the granuloma. Modern medicine continues to surprise us. TNF is a very good example of that. TNF was classically associated with cachexia, and the cachexia of tuberculosis and Slim's disease was all thought to be, and probably is, largely due to TNF. However, so TNF was considered bad until our rheumatologic colleagues decided that treating TNF in chronic rheumatoid arthritis was a really good idea, and it is, because it's done a dramatic job in people with very severe advanced rheumatoid arthritis. Unfortunately, some of them developed tuberculosis, and that's how we really found out that TNF was good. That is, a little bit of TNF was probably key in maintaining those granulomas that allowed the TB to be controlled, and that when you remove the TNF, the granuloma's integrity is affected, and the bug can grow. But I don't know what the relationship might be between chronic particulate exposure and TNF levels. But we do have an environmental scientist in the room here, so maybe you can comment on this a little bit better.
The only thought that comes to mind is perhaps the carbon particle load that the macrophages face on a daily basis, and therefore that embarrasses their general overall
function. Kind of like silicosis, like people with chronic silicosis. Yeah, yeah. There was another hand up earlier, but yes.
What's the status of the antibiotic-resistant strains of TB that seem to come up over the past decade or so in the HIV patient?
So John Johnson, who really knows a huge amount about clinical tuberculosis, will tell me that basically if you have MDR-TB, you have a failed TB control program. What it means is people have access to drugs and are using them badly. And so MDR-TB is a problem. And it creates tremendous headlines, such as the recent extreme TB that was in the Natal province in South Africa, where large numbers of people with advanced HIV died from advanced untreatable tuberculosis. Luckily, it's not become a major, the major driver of the epidemic is garden variety TB that's drug sensitive and not HIV. We work in the Philippines. The Philippines has no HIV. It has MDR TB because the TB program doesn't work very well, and it's one of the top high burden countries in the world. So I'm not trying to say it isn't a problem. It was a problem in the after the Soviet Union fell apart. Communism is extremely good for TB control. In fact, if you want wanted good TB control, Mao Zedong and Stalin would probably be ideal public health officials. But once they disappeared, the system fell apart. And in the jails in particular, we have this problem in the U.S. as well. Not the jails, but people moving back and forth. There's a system of TB control cards so that, for example, Mexican farm workers who come to the U.S. With TB get started on TB treatment. Then when they go back to Mexico, they can continue their treatment. But in the past, they would have to go through this whole system all over again. Now there's a card that's both in Spanish and English, and you can take it across the border. They can bring their card from Mexico and get plugged into the system here, and they can take the card from the U.S. and go back. The same would be true for a Soviet prisoner. Get good TB treatment in jail, and then when he gets out, no system to have him. So that's where you see drug resistance. People not getting good treatment, taking their drugs intermittently. And luckily, it's not yet on the scale that it could be.
Great. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of our terrific alumni here today, our students, thank you both for a terrific presentation today. And for all of you, I think we're concluded for today. Our activities begin back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., registration at 9. So we thank you all. Thank you both.
Thanks.